Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see all of you here on this beautiful spring day, and what could be more appropriate than a day like this for our distinguished spring lecturer. This is sponsored, of course, as you know, by ASEF, the Association of Senior and Emeritus Faculty at the Perelman School of Medicine. We're delighted to have a wonderful speaker today who is quite talented and has achieved an immense number of things in a very short period of time. We hope you'll learn some things, and we'll all try to stay up with her, but we'll have to run relatively fast. After the talk this afternoon, there will be a reception out in the lounge area. I think you probably saw it as you came in. We welcome you all to participate in that, as well as participate in this office, in this particular speech. So thank you very much for coming, and without further delay, I'll introduce our executive council member, Peter Block, who will introduce Danielle Bassett.
Our speaker, Danielle Bassett, started her professional training at the Reading Hospital School for Nursing, but soon switched to Penn State for graduate studies in mathematics, physics, and neuroscience. She did her graduate studies at the King's College in Cambridge and her postdoctoral work and research fellowship at the University of California in Santa Barbara. In 2013, she came to Penn as an associate professor of innovation in the Department of Bioengineering. The following year, she was awarded both the Sloan and MacArthur fellowships. Her research has employed concepts from network science and complex systems to study biological systems, in particular the networks within the human brain. Much work in the field has been focused on capturing single networks that were thought to be representing single tasks. Her work was highlighted that networks are dynamic and reconfiguring constantly. For example, she demonstrated that the flexibility of the brain networks are essential for learning. Individuals in which the networks are flexible learn better than people whose networks are less flexible. There can be a medical issue, however, when the flexibility of the networks is too great. She demonstrated that in schizophrenia, the networks are reconfigured more rapidly than they should. She's published 170 papers, 73 in the last 15 months, which is approximately one per week. Her research involves interacting with multiple institutions and centers at the university, including the Maloney Institute of Neuroscience, the Computational Neuroscience Initiative, which draws together Penn scientists across life sciences, physical sciences, and engineering to study the brain, the Center for Neuroengineering and Therapeutics, the Warren Center for Networks and Data Science, which does research in the interconnected social, economic, and technological fields, the Institute for Research in Cognitive Studies, Cognitive Science, which fosters the development of science of the human mind through interactions of investigators from disciplines of linguistics, math, logic, philosophy, psychology, computer science, neuroscience. I think it includes everybody in this room. And for the Center of Cognitive Science, a multidisciplinary community at Penn dedicated to understanding the neural basis of human thoughts, including such issues as perception, attention, learning, memory, language, decision-making, emotion, and development. She's also a distinguished research fellow at the Annenberg Public Policy Center. Well, how does she find time to be so productive, being involved in all of these activities and still raising a family with 2 young sons? In her TED Talk, she mentions that she puts avocados in her morning coffee. I think that might be the answer for all of us. The topic for her talk today is the network of the human technology, human thought. Sorry.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'll sort of put the Can you hear me in the back? It is on. Can you turn it up in the back a little bit? Yep. And I can also use this if that's probably better. Okay, I'll try to stand still. It's hard for me, but I'll try.
A little closer to the microphone because it is
Okay. Everybody can hear me in the back now? All right, good. Okay. Again, thank you for the introduction. So today what I'm going to do is tell you about some of my work thinking about the network of human thought. But to begin with, what I wanted to first do was to share with you 3 quotes from people in my life, the first one of which is actually from my grandmother, and it's when she learned that I won the MacArthur Award. It's often commonly called the Genius Grant, and she read about it in the newspaper, and she called me up and she said, "I'm not really sure about the genius part, but I'm glad that you got the award." So I certainly have a lot still to do to live up to her expectations for me. So to follow that, I wanted to talk about somebody who exceeded all expectations of himself. This is somebody who I revere, but who was really not thought to be very brilliant initially, and that is Albert Einstein. And the quote that I wanted to share with you is here on the board. It says, "Here arises a puzzle that has disturbed scientists of all periods. How can it be that mathematics, being after all a product of human thought, which is independent of experience, is so admirably appropriate to the objects of reality? Is human reason then without experience merely by taking thought able to fathom the properties of real things?" And the reason that I really love this is, number one, that he's really contemplating what human thought really means, but also that he's linking it with the underlying rules and language of mathematics, which is something I hope to or aspire to. The third quote is actually from me. So brilliant, right? What is human thought? And in order to answer that, I'm going to do a little bit of a thought experiment. So when I think about human thought, I often think about Rodin's work, and specifically The Thinker. And when I begin to think about this sculpture, I wonder what he's thinking about. And I imagine that while he could have been thinking about all sorts of existential things, he could also just have simply been thinking about love and friendship, which motivates much of what we do in our everyday life. And when I begin to think about love and friendship, I begin to think about Facebook, which is sort of where a lot of my friends end up talking to one another. And probably Rodin is not thrilled by the fact that I'm putting Facebook next to his beautiful sculpture, but I wanted to ask the question, is this more than just free association? Is there something underneath of this linkage between ideas? So let's ask that question. What do Facebook and the brain have in common with one another? Facebook obviously is a social engineering system that enables us to talk to one another using technology. The brain is a wet, gooey organ that sits inside of your skull. So on the surface of it, these 2 objects should have nothing in common with one another, right? When I put these 2 up here, you should not think, oh, obviously they're the same. They're really not the same. But the question is there an underlying mathematical representation that can help us to understand both of these systems in a similar way? And a lot of my work is based on the fact that actually they can both be represented as what are called networks. So very simply, a network is something like this. It's a pattern of connections or edges that occur between nodes. So here is one node, for example. It has a connection to this one. And that pattern of connections, we think, has something to do with how the system functions. So how is Facebook a network, and then how is the brain a network? Well, Facebook is a network because each person can be thought of as a node, and then each link between persons can be thought of as a friendship. And then what you can end up having is groups of individuals that tend to be friends with one another. Often they also have certain personalities or other behavioral phenotypes that are similar. And this actually turns out to be very relevant for the brain as well. So how is the brain a network? Again, from the outside, of course, you shouldn't imagine that a little ball and stick figure is really the relevant representation for this system. This is a tissue, it's a volume, it's not discrete. So there are a lot of things about it that suggest that the network representation may not be relevant. However, if you go inside of it, you can actually see that there are very relevant pieces that look like networks. So for example, is the brain actually made of units or nodes, something that we can refer to as the parts of the network? And I think the answer is definitely yes, and it's been viewed as such for many decades. And right here I'm going back to the ideas of phrenology that suggest that there are parts of the brain that code for very specific functions, right? And in this past work or pseudoscience, there was really an idea that there are very abstract concepts like sublimity or ideality or causality or eventuality that are localized in different parts of the brain. So while the exact mapping is not something that we still feel is relevant, the basic idea that there are parts of the brain that codes for specific functions is definitely something that has been validated over and over in the field of neuroscience. So how do we do that now? The way that we usually do that now is that we will put somebody, for example, into an MRI machine or some other way of measuring non-invasively their brain activity, and then we'll have them do something, like, for example, play a set of finger sequence or set of finger movements, and then we watch to see which parts of the brain are highly activated. So, for example, finger movements like this will activate the motor cortex. And what we can do then, using this technique, is that we can identify, well, when somebody is doing this particular task, this part of their brain is highlighted. When they're doing another task, this other part of their brain is highlighted, right? So what this suggests is that there can be a one-to-one mapping, a map from one region to one function, similar to the map that was given by phrenology. Of course, over the last couple of years, it's been evident that there's actually not a single map of one region to one function. Many regions actually perform multiple functions at once. But let's just start with the simple story, which is that there may be a map from region to function. But the challenge is that cognition and multiple kinds of cognition require circuits, not just regions, right? So here, for example, is the canonical language circuit, and it helps us to understand how we actually process linguistic information. So written words can come in through the visual cortex and get sent into Wernicke's area, and then Broca's area, and then out eventually through motor cortex, enabling us to speak and respond to people who are speaking to us, right? So what's important about this picture is that it's not just a set of areas. It's a set of areas that are then connected by tracks or by functional circuitry. So the big question for us is, how do we actually map these connections, and how do we map them non-invasively in humans, and how do we measure individual differences? How is the map in one brain different than the map in another brain? The way that we've been doing this over the last couple years is by using what's called diffusion imaging. So this is a relatively new sort of imaging technique that's available through an MRI machine. And what it does is that it maps out the diffusion of water molecules inside of the brain. Water molecules bounce or move in the brain by Brownian motion, and they're sort of channeled along these big bundles of neuronal axons that are referred to as white matter tracks or white matter fiber bundles. So each of these little lines that you can see almost as threads, they're tiny little threads that you see here, are representative of those big tracks, bundles of neuronal axons that connect one part of the brain to another part of the brain. So what this gives us is a non-invasive map of the circuitry inside of somebody's head, right? And this map can be acquired in an MRI machine over the course of, let's say, 10 minutes. And so with this technique, we can actually map out what makes one person's brain connected differently from another person's brain. It also really brings together the notion that this is actually a network structure. While it's also a volume, it is very realistically a network too. So what we do in my lab is to represent that sort of data as a network, where brain regions are going to be the nodes inside of our network, and then the highways, or these large white matter tracks between areas, are going to be the edges inside of the network. Then the big question is, once we've represented the data in this way, what do we do with it? What we tend to do is to use tools that are being developed and that we help to develop in the area of network science. So network science is an academic field that studies complex networks of all sorts. It doesn't have to be neuronal systems, it's often social systems, by considering distinct elements that are represented by nodes and then the connections between those elements that are represented by edges. So it really develops a powerful set of tools that help us to understand network structures across many different fields, including Facebook, which is sort of where I started. It pulls from many different disciplines, including mathematics, physics, computer science, statistics, and to some degree sociology as well. So intuitively, what is network science? Well, maybe not intuitively, it's actually a whole bunch of math, which so I just sort of have a jumble of equations here and this bar here suggesting that there's a set of mathematical techniques that we can use to probe the architecture of a network organization. So if you look at this network, you could, and I asked you to describe it, you might be able to say, well, there are different colors of the nodes, there's sort of clustering of edges with one another, there's some longer connections farther away, there's some short connections. So you'd be able to qualitatively describe what that structure is. But what network science does is that it gives you mathematical or quantitative estimates of what that network structure is and how it's different between different people. So again, to give you a little bit more of an intuition about how this works, I'm going to show you a toy example here. So here's a very small network, right? And what I might like to do if I was a brain with a very small network is that I would like to be able to transfer information from one part of the brain to another part of the brain, right? Our brains are very much about information processing and about information transmission. So if I want to be able to do that best, what sort of network structure should I have in my head that enables me to do that? So let's imagine that this is my brain, and I want to be able to transmit information from this part to this part. Well, the ideal situation is that I can transfer information from here along this red line to here and here and here. That means that I only need 3 hops or 3 transition points in order to get from one part of the brain to another part of the brain. And that's relatively short. So we'll call, and that's the shortest possible way. The other way I could do it is by going around in circles here for a while and then eventually going over to here, right? That would be a longer path, and sometimes I definitely feel like that's what I'm taking in some of my thought processes. But the ideal situation is that I can transfer information from one side to the other over the shortest possible paths. So that gives us a notion of what makes one brain potentially better for information transmission than another, and that is a quantification of how short the paths are on average. So here, what I have is an illustration of that applied to understanding individual differences in IQ. So this is a really beautiful paper from PLOS Computational Biology in 2011. I was not part of this study, that demonstrates that the IQ of an individual is positively correlated with how short the paths are inside of their brain network. Right? So if on average you have very short paths from one side of the brain to another, you have, in general, a higher IQ than individuals who have longer paths from one part of the brain to another part of the brain. And that's independent of the brain size, very important point. So it's not actually the brain size that matters, it's really this pattern of connectivity that matters. So that's an initial indication that it matters where the connections are for information transmission and for the eventual function of the brain. This is a simulation that tries to, again, give you an intuition for if we have to pass information from one part of the brain to every other part throughout the course of the day, it matters where the connections are, right? You can't pass information from one part of the brain to the other if they're not connected. So it matters how this thing is actually organized for how it can process and transmit information. And that actually brings me to another way in which we can think about these systems as networks. So on the left-hand side, I basically have shown you sort of the highways, the paths along which information can travel. But on the right-hand side, what I'm showing you is potentially which connections are actually being used. And these two might be different from one another, right? The connections that exist may not be the same as the connections that are explicitly used in a very targeted task. So I like to use the analogy of traffic because while there may be highways everywhere, the traffic that actually exists on the highways can change. So ideally what we'd like to do is to actually map out the traffic in a human brain. Unfortunately, there are no current methodologies that enable us to map traffic in a human brain non-invasively. So what we do instead is look at indirect measurements of traffic, very indirect measurements of traffic. And we call these a functional brain network instead of a structural brain network. So it's a different way of thinking about the same sort of problem. In this case, what we're going to do is again treat each brain region as a node inside of the network, but now instead of the edge between those nodes being an actual structural connection, a white matter track between two areas, we're going to say that two regions are connected if they show similar patterns of activity. So for example, in an MRI machine, if two regions are showing an increase in activity together and then a decrease together and then an increase together and then a decrease together, we'll call those two connected with one another. Okay? So technically, this is a statistical similarity in the time series of those two regions. So when we do that for humans, what is the architecture of the network that we observe? And what sorts of techniques or statistics should we quantify from the network? One way that you could go about this question is just to take all the tools from network science that have been developed for many different kinds of systems and throw them at the brain and hope that something works, right? That's one way that you could do it. Alternatively, you could say, we actually know a lot about, well, or at least something about the brain already. Maybe there are tools that are specifically attuned to structures that are important for neural systems. And that latter solution is one that I think is really helpful. So here is a type of network organization that I think is very relevant for neural systems, and that is modular structure or community structure, or this clustering that you observe. And to illustrate the fact, I'm actually going to use a Facebook network, and then I'll show it to you in a brain as well. So this is actually a map of Caltech Facebook friends. So each dot is a student at Caltech, and a connection exists if those two students are friends with one another on Facebook. And what you can hopefully see is that there's really beautiful clustering structure. So people, all these yellow people tend to be together, all the purple people tend to be together, etc. The color actually indicates what house in Caltech they live in. So people who live in the yellow house tend to be friends with one another. People who live in the purple house tend to be friends with one another. There are, of course, people who do not fit that bill. So there's this red guy here who's friends with everybody in the purple house, but not friends with anybody in the red house. So he's sort of a loner in that sense. There are also people in the center here who are friends with many different people at many houses, but not necessarily really focused on one particular house. So those people are probably very important brokers of information and social norms and other sorts of things. The way that we identify this structure in graphs or in networks is by using computational techniques that are drawn from computer science and mathematics. They're basically clustering tools that have been specifically developed for network architectures. So what does that look like in the brain? Well, in the brain, you actually see something very similar. So if you map out the functional connections between different parts of the brain, you see this beautiful modular structure. So on the right-hand side here, you have the brain, and these are the two lateral surfaces and then the two medial surfaces. And on the left-hand side, you have nodes that represent that region of the brain. So the color now, instead of representing a house in Caltech, it now represents a part of the brain, right? So here you have all of these regions in blue that tend to be highly connected with one another, these regions in orange that tend to be highly connected with one another, the parts in red that tend to be highly connected with one another. And this notion that the structure of the brain or the network structure of the brain is very modular is something that's been recapitulated many times over many different studies. And what's also become evident is that that modular structure not only exists, but seems to help us understand what parts of the brain are coding for specific functions. So for example, all of these orange regions are surrounding the motor cortex. So they are often referred to as a motor module. There are also regions of the visual cortex, not shown here, that tend to be very densely functionally connected with one another. Regions in auditory cortex tend to be functionally connected. Regions in frontal parietal executive function circuitry tend to be connected, etc. So what this suggests to us is that the network science tools not only tell us that there's modular structure, but tell us that those modules actually code for similar functions in the brain. So that observation has actually led to really a burgeoning industry of, I think, fascinating questions over many different disciplines. And I wanted to just read a couple of these out to you so that you can see how this touches on disciplines that actually are very far from neuroscience. First is, of course, not far from neuroscience. In psychology, we often ask now, how do network modules change in different brain states when people are performing different tasks? In neuroscience, we want to understand what roles do neurophysiological processes play in these modules, particularly at the neurotransmitter level. In medicine, we want to understand how these networks are altered in psychiatric disease or neurological disorders. In mathematics, we're really interested in understanding what types of graphs brain networks are like and why. In statistics, we want to understand how we can parse significant structure in that network from noise. In physics, we're very interested in what role the network structure plays in the material properties of the brain, and again, why. And in engineering, we ask the question, how can we control this network or potentially design new networks? Finally, in art, we're interested in what role does the network structure play in the creative process and why. So these are all questions in very different domains that center on the observation now that the brain's network structure is organized in these modules that seem to code for specific cognitive functions. So I think this is really exciting, and many of the projects in my lab are now addressing some of these questions in these different fields. But I wanted to ask the question, are we done now? Can we all go home and feel like we've solved the problem? Obviously not. I think there is a lot more to do. And one of the biggest issues that I see with that current state of the field is that it's left out a very critical variable that is really just key or fundamental for understanding brain function, and that is time. Right? You can't just write down a map or even write down a network that's going to tell us everything about how the brain works. What you need is a dynamic description of the system that's going to tell you how it works in time. We have dynamic systems in our brain. We have to perform different tasks throughout the day. We change over development, over normal aging. This thing is not a static picture, right? So if we really want to understand it, we need to take our tools to the dimension of time. So to do that, just sort of schematically, what we do is that we take data from the brain just as we had before, and now what we're going to do is that we're going to look at independent time windows, and within a single time window, we're going to calculate similarity between the activity of two regions, and we're going to put that into the network, and we're going to do that across all possible brain regions and for all possible time windows. So what we'll end up with is a set of networks over time, right, that help us to understand how the patterns of functional connections in our brain change. And what's a really key example of when networks change in our brain? I think a key example is actually in learning. So when individuals learn, patterns of connectivity in their brain have to change in order for behavior to change. So I'm very interested particularly in motor learning. So Peter mentioned that I have two kids. One of them is 5 and one of them is 2. So the 5-year-old can now ride a bicycle. The 2-year-old is still riding a tricycle. But in both cases, I've been very interested in watching how they actually learn those types of functions. And it strikes me that in order to learn something as technically simple as riding a bicycle, you need to bring information from so many parts of your world. You need your motor cortex active and learning. You need your visual cortex to see where you are and link the sort of motor visual skills together with one another. You need your executive function working quite strongly, particularly at my house, so that they don't ride down the hill, which is too steep for them to stop. So there are a lot of different circuits that have to be online and involved in order to enable this to happen successfully. So unfortunately, we can't stick a kid on a tricycle in a scanner for obvious reasons. So what we do instead is study something that's just a set of finger sequences. And this is work that was done in collaboration with Nicholas Wins and Scott Grafton at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And what people do is that they see in the scanner a pseudo-musical staff with a set of buttons that they can press. And this says press the purple button and then the blue and the green and the red, etc. So this is a set of finger movements that they need to learn over the course of 3 days. So in peach is day 1, blue is day 2, green is day 3. On the y-axis here, I have the length of time it took them to practice one of these little sequences, and then on the x-axis, I have the number of trials, or the trial bin. What you observed is that initially, it takes them about 5 seconds to play one of these sequences, and then by the end of day 3, they're down to about 3 seconds. The variance here is standard deviation of the mean over subjects in the sample. So what's happening in the brain as people are learning, right? The big question is, we know that behavior is changing up here. The brain has to be doing something that enables that to occur. So to study that, what we did is that we took they were practicing in the scanner for an hour and a half for each of these days. So we have an hour and a half plus an hour and a half plus an hour and a half's worth of data. We separate that out into individual time windows and then compute a functional connectivity matrix, so this little network. And we do that for all small time windows. In this first study, we had 75 networks in a row, and in following studies, we had more. So what do we do with that? So again, the naive thing to do would be to say, well, I have all of these little networks. I'm going to study them each independently and see how they change. But that's not really, it doesn't remain true to the fact that these networks are ordered in time. This is not really a set of independent elements, it's a set of ordered elements, right? So we want to maintain that order in the analysis that we perform. So to do that, what we do is construct what's called a multi-layer network. So here on the right-hand side is a multi-layer network. Here is a little network of 4 nodes and 4 edges, just as an example. And you can see that it's connected to itself in time, right? And the way that we connect it is that we link a node in one layer to itself in the next layer, or time window. So this node's connected to itself, itself, and itself. And the same with the blue node, same with this one, same with that one, right? So what that helps us to do is to basically create a string of networks that encodes the order in which it all occurred. Because the brain is not bouncing around randomly as it's learning. It actually has a very specific order in which it goes through the processes that need to occur. So once we have that multi-layer structure, then we actually do something very similar to what we did with the Caltech Facebook network, and that is identify modules or clusters and how those clusters change over time. We use this really beautiful mathematical work that was done by my colleagues Peter Muka and Mason Porter in a science paper in 2010. And what it basically does is it enables you to look for these clusters while obeying that order of time. What's interesting about this is that you can have many different changes in the network that occur. So here what I'm illustrating to you is 2 clusters that were initially separate may come closer and closer together over time. But you can also observe the opposite. So there may be 2 clusters that break apart. There may be one part of the network that moves away or that switches which module it's assigned to. So there are many different characteristics of the dynamics that you could probe with this approach. What we decided to do is to focus on a really simple estimate of how much change actually occurred in the network. And for that, we quantified what we called the network flexibility. So the flexibility of one node in this network is going to be how many times that node changed the module that it was associated with, or the cluster that it was associated with. So if you have one node that changes frequently, it's going to be very flexible. And if you have one node that changes very rarely, it's going to be not very flexible. So you can define that for a single region or a single node, but you can also define it for an entire brain, right? So you can see on average, all of the regions in this brain tend to change the cluster assignments frequently, and then, or on average over this entire brain, the regions tend to change their cluster assignments very rarely. Right? So we did that, and we actually observed a positive relationship between that amount of network flexibility and the amount that somebody learned this task over the course of the 3 days of practice. The regions that seemed to be probing that the most were areas in association cortex in the brain rather than actually motor or visual cortex. So after that initial study, I asked the question of myself. I mean, learning is a wonderful thing, right? I know how to ride a bike, but there may be other things that I might like to learn. So is there a way for me to make my brain more flexible to potentially enable learning more generally? And so I asked the question, well, maybe I should, be having a little bit more caffeine. Maybe that would be a good way to be more flexible. Maybe I should read more classic literature. I'm sure that I should do that. I should probably eat more vegetables. I love gluten of all sorts. And then I should also probably do more hikes with my kids and my husband. So maybe each of these would be great ways in which to increase the flexibility of my brain. So to take this beyond just sort of a thought experiment, what we did is a couple different studies that try to ask these questions really from a scientific perspective. This is the first one, and it was work that was done by my postdoc, Rick Betzel, who took some data that was actually acquired from a cognitive neuroscientist who did the field really a wonderful thing, which was to scan himself twice a week for a year and then deposit all of that data online for anybody to use. So it's a really wonderful thing that this person did for the field. And so what we can do is we can study that and the changes in the patterns of connectivity in his brain over time and link it up to changes in his physiology, in his mood, and in his cognitive abilities. So here what Rick did is that he showed that the amount of flexibility that's present in this individual's brain is correlated with how positive the person felt, how attentive or aroused the person felt, and both of these were independently related to whether the individual was rested and had been fed that morning. So very basic things, right? Make sure that you sleep the night before, make sure that you have food in the morning. That usually leads to a more positive attitude, and then that brings with it brain flexibility. So it's not rocket science, right? So this was really nice, a sort of demonstration that this overall phenotype that we'd been observing in the dynamic networks was related to physiological differences that can change day to day. So after that, we asked, well, if this is something that's true in healthy individuals, it could be that there are individuals for whom they can't simply change their way of life, or they can't change their mood on demand. Most of us can't change our mood on demand. So are there interventions that we can use to change brain flexibility externally? And for that, we collaborated with Heike Toast and Andreas Meyer-Lindenberg, who are at the Central Institute of Mental Health in Mannheim, Germany. And what they did is that they had this really wonderful study of 41 individuals who underwent a pharmacological challenge with an NMDA receptor antagonist, dextromethorphan to be specific. And what you can see here is the amount of flexibility in their brains, whether they were on placebo or on DXM. And you can see a significant increase in flexibility on DXM. So that suggests that we can actually use medication, particularly that targets glutamate, to change the brain flexibility as a whole in individual subjects. We're following up on this because I actually think, given the effects of positive mood over here, probably there are other neurotransmitters that are involved as well. So we're trying, and also the fact that attention or arousal was also related suggests that there may be a role to play for norepinephrine, for dopamine, and potentially for serotonin too. So we're following up on each of those questions now. But first of all, for those who don't know, dextromethorphan is actually in cough syrup. So an interesting question is whether we should all just be having more cough syrup. And the answer is definitely not. So here's some data or a sort of meta-analysis of studies that we have now published that suggests that the relationship between cognitive function, particularly executive functions, and flexibility may follow an inverted U-shaped curve. So we have a couple papers that suggest that flexibility of brain dynamics increases over development. And then in healthy, high-functioning adults, we see that higher flexibility is better for cognitive function. But then in two papers now in schizophrenia, we observe that the amount of flexibility that's present in their networks is much, much higher than in the individuals, the healthy individuals. So that suggests, and we also know that people with schizophrenia obviously have executive function deficits. So it suggests to us that there may be this inverted U-shaped curve. We're focusing a lot of our efforts right now on trying to map out that curve a little bit better. So to me, this suggests that there may be different sorts of flexibility, not just that there's an inverted U-shaped curve, but maybe there are different sorts of flexibility. So the sort of flexibility that's observed in someone who has schizophrenia may be quite different than the sort of flexibility that's observed in a healthy individual. Similarly, the type of flexibility that's present in an adult may be quite different than that that's present in a 4-year-old child, right? So what we would like to do is to understand a little bit more about the different kinds of flexibility that may exist and how they might relate to smaller subdomains of cognitive function. The other question I wanted to ask is, does this really help us to understand different sorts of thoughts? And why do I ask that question? Well, going back to the very beginning of my talk, I promised you that I would give you a talk on the network architecture of human thought. And so far what I've done is given you a lecture on the network architecture of the brain. But technically they're not the same, right? The brain is an organ that produces thought or that is associated with thought, but they're not the same thing. So the question, just to be completely honest with you, is that what we've discussed right now is a body of work that describes the network architecture of the organ that produces human thought. And what I promised you was a body of work that describes thought architecture itself. So I haven't really done that. But I think I'm going to ask the question, can we use this current information that I've shown you to understand how humans actually think? And this is more ongoing work and something that I'd be happy to talk to you about, especially over the food and drinks later. But so network architecture of human thought, right? That's the title that I gave the talk. So first of all, if we really want to target that question, can we say something about how thoughts are networks? And to answer that, what I've done is I've shown you a little few bits from the literature suggesting that knowledge is a network, language is a network, and written text is a network, and all of these are actually much closer to thought than the neurophysiological data that I showed you earlier. So here, for example, is a network of knowledge. So how the seasons are affected by the amount of sunlight, which is then affected by the height of the sun above the horizon, or can be determined by the height of the sun above the horizon, etc. So concepts are related to one another by causal relationships. Similarly, language, different phonemes are related to one another probabilistically in a particular language, and that probability differs from language to language, right? And then on the right-hand side, written text can also be thought of as a network if you take each of the words in the written text as your node, and then you connect up two words if they tend to be found together with one another close by in a large corpus. So for example, school and bus tend to be found close to one another very often in the written literature, whereas school and plum are not as often found next to one another in the literature. However, if you follow from school to bus to yellow to banana to apple to plum, that works quite well, right? So there is a network architecture in the sort of concepts that we use to describe our world and our experiences. So the question that I had then is, well, if we can think about concepts or ideas as nodes, and then we think about the transition from one idea to the next as a thought, or even the concept itself as a thought, although I think thoughts are more about the transition from one idea to the next, then we can really think about thought as a network. So that got me really excited about the idea of curiosity. So how do we build these networks of knowledge inside of our head? Or how do we build our networks of thought? Or how do we train them? And I think one of the ways that we do that is using curiosity. So here's a pictorial example. Let's say that this is your current idea, this little gray one. I meant to change this to yellow to be sort of bright, right? You have a bright idea. So you have that bright idea, and then you're looking for other ideas. Sometimes you might want to get these pink ones that are nearby to one another. You're going to seek all of that information that's close by. But maybe you're not the kind of person that likes to find the information close by. Maybe you like to find new ideas that are actually a little farther away. Or maybe you really like to find ideas that are very far away from where you currently stand. And you get much more excited about distant ideas than about close by ideas. Or you could be the opposite. Maybe you love to get the close by ideas because that makes you feel like you're really building the knowledge space in a regular way. So how do we look for pieces of information? Do we look for them close by or far away? You could probably imagine different people in your life that like to do one of these versus the other, right? What then do you do with that idea or concept? Sometimes you actually just want to take all of those new ideas and stick them in a bag and save them for later, right? You love to gather ideas, you love to gather trivia, but you might not do anything with it right away. Maybe you'll do something with it later. Alternatively, maybe you'll take those ideas and you'll link them up to your current idea so that you really understand what the relationship is of where you currently sit to the new information that you've gathered. You really want to incorporate that new information into your current knowledge space or your current idea space, right? Alternatively, maybe you really want to do that, but you also want to connect up all the new ideas to one another. So you really understand all of the relationships between all of the ideas that are in your head. It can be exhausting, but some of us really love to do that very much, right? So again, there may be different points in your life that you like to do one of these versus another, or there may be different people that like to do one of these more than another. So the networks that we like to build, what do they look like? Again, I think for some of us, we really want to have all of the details and fit them into our current body of knowledge. So that looks like this. Maybe this is the kind of network that you really love to build. You like to build connections to local ideas, and then you like to understand how each of them are related to all the other ones next to them, right? So you build really dense networks. Alternatively, maybe you're okay with some holes in your network. You're okay with not understanding all of the relationships between all of the items that you have in your head. Some of us like small holes, some of us are okay with really, really big holes. This is the person that says, spare me the details, I really just want to get the gist, right? So there are different kinds of networks that we each like to build, and for some of us in some parts of our life, we like to build one kind versus another. So what are the actual dynamics of understanding or building those networks? I wanted to illustrate to you three different kinds of people or three different kinds of curiosity. So the gray one, the pink one, and the yellow one. And again, I shouldn't have chosen gray because it seems like it has a bad connotation that it's not curious, but that's not really what I meant. So take the color out of it if you can. So on the top here, I have time. And here I have an illustration of your current network of knowledge or your current network of ideas that you're really excited about. This person really likes new ideas, so they try to find an idea that's far away from their current space. And then they like to figure out how they can fit that into what they already know, but it might take a while, right? So they're okay with taking a leap, but then they really want to bring it back to the knowledge space that they already have, right? So you end up getting these kind of tendrils of knowledge that can occur. Alternatively, you can have this person. They start with the same maybe basic knowledge space, and then they like to grow it by having natural extensions of what they already know. They're a very steady builder. They build with the same rules that they started with, and they don't change their rules as they go. So they end up building a very progressive, regular lattice-like structure. Alternatively, you can have the person who loves to leap to a new idea, but then likes to regain their footing and understand the relationships between all of those ideas before leaping again, right? And so this person ends up having little clustering structures that are separated by longer distances. And again, each of us may have different times in which we like to build in these different ways. So the open questions that we're trying to target right now are, number one, what is the network architecture of thought more generally, but curious thought specifically, because I think that gives us a little bit of traction on focusing on how to begin here. And then secondly, how are the networks built up over time? And then third, is there a map between these flexible brain networks that I told you about for the first 40 minutes of the talk and these curious thought networks? So is it the case that somebody who has a very flexible brain network is somebody who takes the leaps, whereas somebody who has a less flexible brain network may be the one who doesn't take the leaps in the idea space? That's obviously just a silly little inkling, but what we'd like to do is to understand to what degree the underlying neurophysiology is related to these more abstract concepts of thought patterns. So the bigger picture, just to close, is that what we're trying to do is to understand the brain basically as a social network, using tools from network science to understand questions not just about clinical care, but also about education. And I'd be happy to talk to you about some of those efforts, again, over the food afterwards. So I'd like to acknowledge all of the people who are in my group, the work of my collaborators who I tried to point out as we went along, and of course the funding agencies who were kind enough to support the work. And I'd like to end with be curious, and thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Danny. That was a spectacular talk. We're all trying to get our curiosity up and shorten those network connections and help us get from one side of the brain to the other. Does the avocado work? I mean, I'm just curious. Well, I don't know whether we have, I think we do have some avocado out there on the table.
I haven't done a clinical trial, so I don't know.
Obviously, next step. Shall we ask for any questions? Any questions from the audience? I'll let you
Lots
call
of
on them.
questions. All right, I'm going to...
So the question is, are these the nodes that you have in your network? Do they assume the same amount of weight in contributing to the network?
Do the nodes have the same amount of weight? Right.
In other words, are the weighting, the connections between are considered as equal connections?
The weights are actually all different, right? So the weight is given by how similar, in the brain, the weight is given by how similar the activity time series are. In the thought networks, I think it's given, again, by the similarity of the ideas or the similarity of the concepts.
So how do you determine those weights?
In which space? The brain?
The brain,
Yeah, it's based on usually what we use is a coherence of wavelet coefficients. So we use wavelets basically to look at specific frequency bands that are less affected by artifact in the MRI. And then from those wavelet coefficients, we compute a magnitude squared coherence, which basically says, to what degree do they have similar power spectral densities.
But how accurate that is? I mean, how does it represent the reality based on the imaging that
They're accurate to the degree that the networks that we observe track behavioral change. So what we try to do in our studies is to link changes in the network to changes in behavior. And as long as those two are correlated, we see that as sort of an external validation of the metrics we're using. Yeah, in the back.
Now I know what it means to think outside the box. And, I'm wondering, I think I kind of know the answer, but is there a tendency for younger individuals to have the idea where they're thinking, that far away and coming back? I'm bringing to mind, I've heard that a lot of mathematicians are young when they do their best stuff. Like I've heard that once you get to be 40, you're done. But is there a propensity that the younger individuals seem to do more of this thinking, like I said, outside the box than the older ones?
I think it depends how you define outside the box. I mean, from the brain flexibility standpoint, we actually see that young adults have higher brain flexibility than the youngest children. But to what degree that relates to really unusual ideas is open. I think kids often have very unusual ideas, but I don't think that unusual is necessarily good. I think what I'm looking for is not just that an idea is crazy. We can all come up with crazy ideas. The question is, are you looking for the ideas that are maybe far away and yet relevant for you to make traction on a question, right? And that's different, and kids learn that over time. They're not necessarily good at that when they're young. I speak from experience. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you deal with the time resolution problem? Because the time resolution of MRI is very poor compared to the time resolution of thought.
Yeah.
The connectivity, the network connectivity is going to be distorted by that.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the motor learning experiments, we focused on MRI because we could get better spatial resolution, but also because the amount of learning or the time scale of the learning is actually pretty slow. So we're really looking at things that change, behavior that changes over hours, weeks, even months. But when you're talking about thought, you're absolutely right that occurs on a much shorter time scale, or can occur on a shorter time scale. So for that, I think that what we need to do is to use measurements like MEG or EEG or ECOG to study things like that. But the other question is, I think it's a little bit tricky to say, well, if you really want to understand patterns of thought, is a pattern of thought something that you're going to measure in a half-hour scanning session, or is it something that really becomes evident over years of somebody's life? And for some of that, we're actually going back to written work and watching how written work changes from a single author to really quantify the long timescale changes that you wouldn't be able to address in an MRI machine.
Yeah. So, you showed that the IQ is higher if the shorter distances are observed, in the network. Is this the assumption is that the speed is the same of transferring information? Or do we measure speed of transferring the information?
In that study, they didn't measure processing speed, no.
Right. So the question is it the speed is a factor, and is it the shortest distance is the answer? Right? So I think
Yeah,
some
no, right. I don't think that a shortest distance is necessarily the answer. This may also be a U-shaped curve, because what ends up happening if you have a network that has the shortest possible paths is actually a random network, which means that every region is randomly connected to something else, and that is very difficult to fit into a small space. We would lose we would violate all sorts of constraints on volume of tracks, etc. So we have important physical constraints in our brain that make it so that we can't have a random graph in our head. So clearly the shortest distance, while I mentioned that as an illustration of the idea because I think it's intuitive, it's not the only thing that matters.
So then how the fractal geometry, you said it's hard to fit in. So brain's a fractal geometry for that reason. How does that come to account in terms of conserving space?
Yeah, it's very fractal, which helps to conserve space. Absolutely. So basically you have, what you end up having, I talked to you about sort of first level modules. What you end up having is those clusters or modules are composed of smaller and smaller ones, right? And then there's this sparse connectivity between modules. And that helps to enable both on average a short path length, but also localization of function, which would have been destroyed if it was a random graph. Yeah.
So in your thought network model, it seems like you're assuming that the types of ideas you look for are the ones you
defined. So if you like close ideas, those are one defined. If you like farther ones, those are the ones defined. What happens, for instance, if you like closer ideas, but you stumble upon the
Farther, yeah.
ignore it or have to change your way of thinking?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. Right. I haven't thought a lot about what happens when you inadvertently find something. I've been thinking more about the fact that you usually are looking for something and it takes you a long time to find it, and you go through many things that aren't it before you get to it, right? I think, at least in research, that feels much more common. But in definitely in the you do, some people, yeah. That's an important point. And in fact, many people will read in a completely opposite topic or go to a seminar on a topic that they don't know anything about and then stumble on an idea that they could find useful. Yeah, I'll have to try to think about how to encode that. Thanks. Yeah.
So, Danielle, your major tools are diffusion tensor imaging for structural connectivity.
For humans, at least. For humans, we're using diffusion imaging. We also do some animal work where we're using track tracing data. And then for function, for most of the learning experiments, we're using fMRI, but we also do work with MEG and with ECOG data as well.
You describe learning as a change in the network configuration. What about immediate memory? That is, you just heard what I've said. You have some memory of it. The reconfiguration doesn't occur that quickly, right?
Right.
So how do you describe what's happening?
And how does memory encoding work? I don't know. I don't know. It's not something that I have done much work on yet. It's a good question. Any other questions?